talking about Trumbull's Hints on Child Training, which spends a good deal of time talking about the difference between will training and will breaking. And through this, you see his emphasis on a child's agency. And he goes back to God for the source of this. He says, a child's personality is to be held sacred by God's representative who is over the child, even as God himself holds sacred the personality of every human being created in the image of God. And he goes on to talk about how God grants human beings agency and choice, that God never says to a human being, you shall not exercise your faculty of choice. Now, he goes on to kind of talk about how then this is a privilege. This is something parents need to be careful with. They need to study their children to understand who is in front of them and how they operate. But it's a marked contrast between, for instance, James Dobson's who's going to win here. That's not the question. He, in fact, says a conflict between a parent and child where the only question, whose will shall yield to the other, is, after all, neither more nor less than a conflict of brute force. And he says, in fact, if you force a child to do your will, that's not a success. He says success in any such case is always a failure. So for Trumbull, nobody's entitled to use their will to dominate another. So a father is not entitled to have their will stand in the place of a child's will, but that the parental task is to think of the well-being of the child, the needs that are going to be placed on them in their place in society, like the reality that the world cannot bend into them, that things won't always go the way they want. And how do you train a child to choose the good? He says, okay, you should try to reason with a child first. You should try and empathize with a child and reason with them. You should try and urge them to make a wise choice. But if things come to a conflict, if worse comes to worse, he says, the parent should say, Johnny, I shall have to give you your choice in this matter. You can either shut that door, that's his example, or take a whipping. And then that's the choice given to the child. So you do see a corporal punishment of his day, whipping, I think, here, or Elizabeth Elliot talks about this as far as like with a switch. I don't know what Trumbull would have thought of it as, but here, and I think there's only maybe one other passing reference to corporal punishment. So there's certainly not the methodology that would be the main way. The main way he sees parents to get at their parenting goals would be through attempting to reason with the child. Another thing Trumbull says is that parents should really try to limit opportunities for conflict, minimize the amount of times that they will require obedience. And this jumped out at me simply because you have Wilson or the Pearls or others kind of saying, no, you should look for the opportunity to dominate the will of the child. Like that's part of the training. Like, oh, good, here's a chance to do it. We have Nancy Wilson saying that about her daughter's attitude about not wanting to leave, her disappointment in leaving a play date. You see the Pearls talk about this. They actually say you should craft these scenarios where there's something a child wants that you say no to, so that then you punish them, and you're setting up scenarios where you train it. And Trumbull would kind of say the opposite. Like you should mitigate your power such that you are minimizing those things, and you should bend when possible. He gives an example later on of what he calls over-parenting, where parents were kind of hyper-controlling every choice their daughter did. And his advice in that scenario was to let it go. He gives an example of a shutting a door, maybe the same example to a daughter asking a parent saying, will you please go shut the door? And if the daughter doesn't want to give it a pause and then say, and it's okay if you don't, I will get up and do it. So his approach is very distinct from the who's going to win, everything's a battle. In fact, he would say, let's not have a battle. Like that's not the framework he's offering.